All right, let's jump into this. It is day 9 of the RPG a Day calendar month event, and today is medium. And medium could be interpreted a bunch of different ways, right? Um, it could be interpreted in terms of like the actual medium of the game itself, how it's printed, the format that it takes, all of that. That's medium, right? Could be talking about ghosts, right? Seances. That's what Roland's been talking about. Wanted to beat the shit out of Gygax's ghost. I love it. Um, but I was thinking about it, or when I first saw the word medium, I thought about it in terms of small, which was 2 days ago. So if 2 days ago we were talking about small and the concept of small, and we talked about small mediums in terms of like the business cards and postcards and stuff like that, but also small RPGs, I figured we would talk about medium as medium RPGs. And when I say medium RPGs, what do I mean? Let's just start off right away. As with all of these videos, this is my subjective opinion about things. All right? It's not, I'm not preaching gospel. This isn't to be interpreted as 100% correct. Um, I've already seen folks, by me just mentioning the idea of medium, immediately disagreeing with each other about what is rules light and rule is crunchy. And that's good. Like we all have different interpretations of that, but like just keep that in mind that I might talk about something being rules light in my mind or rules crunchy in my mind, and I'm not saying that it has to be the same thing for you. Um, so yes, what do I mean by rules medium? Like Dice Ghost says in chat, what I was thinking was the space between rules like games and bigger games, crunchy games, right? And in order to talk about that, we kind of need to define those two things, rules light and crunchier. And both of those exist on a spectrum of crunch. So, really, crunch is the thing that we need to talk about in order to figure out what medium crunch even feels like. I'm going to pitch right now, before we jump into this, that most games are rules medium. I'm going to say most games are rules medium, and we tend to throw around terms like rules light a lot more often than it actually is. And I think we think crunchy is maybe like this big scary word that uh, people don't like sometimes. Oh, Gunfucks, you are right, Adira. We're gonna just pivot. Let's talk about how awesome Gunfucks is. That would be great. Jacob online mentions that crunch is maybe something like how often you need to look up what a roll means on a table, perhaps. Um, yeah, yeah, MV. This is how I'm interpreting the word medium instead of probably the way that everybody else looked at it. Okay, so what is crunch, right? Crunch is again one of those abstract things. It's one of those horrible words that you know it you know it when you see it, right? That's what crunch is. You see it and you go, ah, that's crunch. Uh, and so, what exactly does that mean? It can't just be rules, right? We can't just say all rules are crunch because I don't think that's a an adequate definition. Plus, then why do we have another word for it? It's just rules then. Envy's seen some crunchy cereals. I love a good crunchy cereal, personally. I had some honey bunches of oats this morning. So, I don't know, is that crunchy? It seems kind of crunchy to me. Um, so what is crunch then? Like what is crunch in an RPG, at least in terms of my thought about it? To me, the way I interpret rules crunch is moving pieces. The number of moving pieces in a game to me dictates how crunchy it is. Um, Crunch feels like cognitive load to me. Yeah, I think that's a good way of thinking about it. If, something that is crunchier is going to be more cognitively taxing. It's going to use up more of your working memory capacity than something that has less of it. Although we have to think about crunch as something that exists on like a time spectrum as well, because some games are just consistently crunchy. It's just like nonstop crunch. It's we're doing a lot of math, we're doing a lot of calculations, we're thinking a lot about all the interactions between various keywords, distances, and stuff like that. So your big tomes are going to be crunchy just all the time, right? Your Shadowruns is going to be crunchy all the time. I think Pathfinder is crunchy all the time. Um, and then there are other games where it's crunchy in certain parts, and then other parts there's a relaxation of that crunch, and so it's not a consistent thing. So I like the idea of using cognitive load as part of our definition of it, at least for some of the time. But there are games out there that I don't think tax us cognitively as heavily as other games, but still would be considered crunchy. Which goes back to my the way that I was thinking about it, which is the number of moving parts, the intricacy, the is it a simple clock or is it like one of those little pocket watches that has tons and tons of tiny little gears that if one thing goes off, things start to get maybe not broken, but start to slow down or get a little wonky. Um, Lancer's whole mech pilot dichotomy. Mech shit's crunchy, pilot's basically freeform. Yeah, something like that, right? Where there are times where a game can be crunchy and times where it doesn't have to be. Um, so Jacob Online mentions thinking about it, a major component of is how many discrete steps you need to go through to finish the gameplay loop. Well, that's an interesting way of thinking about it, right? So the gameplay loop specifically from GM describes situation to GM updates the situation. That's an interesting way of thinking about it too. And again, we think about that on a time spectrum in which there are certain situations where that is more the case or that is a slower or more intricate process, and then other situations in which that is not as intricate. So Sean Drake mentioned this on Twitter as one of the first things that was thrown out of Blades in the Dark being a rules medium game. I think Blades is such an interesting one to talk about because I think people just generally have strong feelings about Blades one way or another. I am in the camp that I enjoy Blades. I like Blades quite a bit. Um, but I will also say that this is a big ass book, and for somebody to say that this is rules light, I don't think that's not true to me. That's not true to me. There are a lot of moving pieces in Blades in the Dark. I remember the first time I played this with some friends that I had been playing role-playing games with for years. It was a relatively easy teach for them because they were familiar with concepts of role-playing games, even though the system here was not one that they were familiar with. But then I promised to another couple of friends, this game's so easy. We'll just jump right in. It's going to be like, you'll learn it real quick. And then we sat down to do character creation, and I didn't think about it ahead of time. I just said, we'll just do it as is, as the book is written. And it took us a long time to build a character. Why? Because all of the steps along the way, because I just kind of assumed, oh, we'll just get through the rules, we'll explain them as they come up. The friends naturally had questions at every step, like, well, what about this? What does this do? And I realized that there's a lot of moving pieces in Blades in the Dark, right? It's it's easy to try and boil it down to just saying it's position and effect, and you roll a d6 dice pool and you keep the highest. Sure, for like the core mechanic, that's the easiest we can sort of boil it down. You still have to explain what risk, position, and effect is, but that's not all Blades in the Dark is. If that was it, it wouldn't be this long, right? There's all the other parts that are going on inside of it, and I think, and again, this is my opinion, I truly enjoy Blades, that once you understand the parts, it's a fun machine to play in. The machine starts to run itself. The gameplay loop makes sense to me, and I can get into it. Um, I also understand that some people might think, "Oh, cool, rules light heist game," and then they see this and they go, "This doesn't seem rules light," and they would be fair to say that. Um, yeah, exactly, Jake. It's a simple core. I truly believe it's a relatively simple core, but uh, there are layers. And I don't even necessarily think they're layers. I think we have like this one giant gear of our watch. And as long as that gear is moving, the core mechanic is moving, the watch is working mostly. It's mostly keeping the time. But there's all these other tiny gears that are also making sure that it stays accurate, that things run smoothly. Those are all of the other little components to the game, and that's crunch. That is what crunch is to me, is all the other gears that like help the big gear do its job in a really cool, interesting way, other than it just being a big ass gear. Um, so like Sean says, the game collapses down to a simple thing, but there's a big book about ways that you change how simple. Exactly, exactly. I think that's a good extension of the analogy, Jake, of the big gear, the other gears, all the other things are going to do all the other things that your watch could do. Date, air pressure, alarms, all of the other things. The big gear, the core mechanic, pretty straightforward if you ask me. And so it does what it needs to do. And then, like Sean says, we can boil it down, and then we change the way that that big gear runs through all these other little gears that kind of weave their way into it. So a rules-like game then versus a crunchy game is one, in my opinion, a rules-like game is one in which there are a few gears. There are very few um, interpretations or variations in the rule that you have to deal with. Lasers and feelings would be a good example of a rules-like game, right? It's pretty straightforward how lasers and feelings work. Um, there's like a lot of the one-page RPGs that are out there are really elegant in their simplicity. And like simple doesn't mean bad. Simple means we get to actually play the game fast and quickly, which to me is amazing. So rules like games are games, in my opinion, that have fewer of those gears. It's a simple watch or a simple clock as opposed to a fancy ass intricate pocket watch or an Apple Watch or whatever the hell kind of fancy watch that you could possibly have. Jacob Online says that they are focused. Focus is an interesting word because, like, I think Blades is focused. Why do I think Blades is focused? I think it focuses on all of the elements that are important to what the game wants to do. I don't think there's too much in the Blades book that necessarily gets in the that is unfocused on the intent of what John was trying to accomplish. Um, so focus is an interesting word. I don't. I'll think about that. Let me think about that. I got some other books here. We've got Necronautilus. Um, Necronautilus is by Adam Vass. This is an interesting one. So here's an example. So obviously much smaller book, right? Much smaller than we were looking at before. I would consider Necronautilus to not be rules light. Despite it being, I don't know, way smaller than Blades in the Dark. Not as a knock against Adam. I think this is the perfect length for Necronautilus. But I also don't think I would call Necronautilus rules light. Why? There are gears here, and the gears are they're like made of different material and different shapes and stuff like that. What do I mean? They rely on different types of mechanics. So in Necronautilus, for example, you've got a system that largely revolves around interpretation of words, almost like a Mad Lib sort of thing going on here. It's really very cool the way that you can like enact change and power and influence in the world around you as these death agents. But then there are other things that are they work under similar principles, but they aren't exactly the same thing. Like when you're thinking about like your luck mechanic and your health and like the memories component, and then there's the ship travel stuff that don't all necessarily work under the same assumptions or rules as like the core mechanic. And so as a result, I don't think Necronautilus is rules light. I think of it as rules medium. MV asks, do procedures fall under crunch? Could you give me like an example, MV, just so that I'm making sure that we're like vocabulary wise we're thinking about the same thing? Like, could you give me an example or two of procedures just so that I have a sense of um what you might be asking about, just so that I don't misinterpret. And then here's another big ass book, Bastionland. But Bastionland, is it complex? No. It all the rules are on 2 pages. That's all you need to play Bastionland. This is literally it that you need to play Bastionland. So what the hell is the rest of the book? It's all the really cool debts and stuff like that. So I mean, this thing is just mostly filled with very cool like setting and lore stuff, which is neat, like building stuff. But I think that generally it's actually a pretty loose framework by comparison. Um, so where am I going or what am I getting at here? I don't really know exactly. I'm still kind of wrapping my head around the concept of rules medium. I think like the thesis that I mentioned at the beginning, I think most games are rules medium. I think a lot of the games that we tend to tout as rules light are not. I have been touting for the longest time most of my games as rules light, and I think I'm grappling and coming to terms with the fact that I don't think that they are. I don't think that they are necessarily rules light anymore. Like for example, light, ha ha ha. I've been talking a lot about as a rules light adaptation of Destiny. But light is not rules light. Why isn't it rules light? Yes, I am the one who got a review complaint about rules light. I had somebody complain who automatically took a star off of my um took a star off their rating on itch because the inherent fault of rules light games. Um, she's like, okay, I guess. Um, but rules, but light is not rules light because another, if we're talking about gears, like the number of different like moving pieces in your game, there's actually a lot of them in light. I've made a lot of them. I've made a bunch of modules that you can decide which you want to keep, which you want to include, and that it probably starts as rules light in its core rules, but the second you start slapping on new modules, I think we start to escape the rules light space. There's some people that have been talking, I haven't kept up. So dungeon crawling is a procedure like the whole 2 in 6 chance for a door to be stuck every turn in 10 minutes rolling on the encounter table. Gotcha. So stuff like that. Um, Adira asks a really interesting question. Do we need a category called rules medium? I don't know. I don't know. I do we? Of course we don't. Should we? I don't know. Um, the drop rules in light are procedures. Like generating loot? Because here's the thing, I don't want to. Yeah, it's gonna like. Do we really need one more thing in the taxonomy of RPGs? Um, Chewy category. Ooh. Chewy is interesting as a concept because I only say this because of my anecdotal evidence of when I thought I would convince my friend or I teach my friend how to play Blades really quick because I thought it was a rules-like game, and then I realized it wasn't. But I also, if I had pitched it to him as a crunchy game, as a complicated game, he wouldn't have wanted to play it. So I'm not saying that I want a category so I can trick my friends, but I want a category that represents the complexity of the game fairly to the people who might be considering playing it. Um, because eventually, once we got past that awkward first session, he had a great time. He loved it. He was then one of the three Blades campaigns that I had ongoing at the same time. So he really did enjoy the game. It was just a bumpy start because I had pitched it to him as one way because I truly only knew at the time the two ways of describing games. It's either rules light or it's complicated. It's crunchy. And so having an alternative might be helpful. I also think that rules medium games best get taught and experienced without all the rules. But they have the ability and the adaptability to to incorporate those rules, those ones that you admitted, back into the system relatively seamlessly. As opposed to games where a crunchier game where all of the systems kind of need to be in play from the beginning, so you kind of just have to know how it all works from the beginning. Um, or a rules like game where you say, this is how it works, that's it. A rules medium game says, yeah, you could probably get away with this, and then you move forward. You add on from there. Chewy is a good word. I kind of like chewy as a category. Maybe I'll just start calling all of my games Chewy games. So I missed stuff earlier in chat though. What would I consider 24XX? I haven't really played the game, so I don't want to throw down an interpretation of it just because it's been a long time since I read 2400. That's how I read it, by the way. I don't know how other people read it. And so I'm gonna pass on that. So MV said, for example, to travel through a hex, roll a die and check weather, spend a point of stamina. So, those are examples of procedures in a game. Is that the same thing as crunch? Was that the original questions? Do procedures fall under crunch? In this case, I would say yes. Based off of how I'm interpreting the word crunch as like extra gears that work in the clock that is the machine, the game. Oh my god, my analogy is getting horrible. Uh, if those gears can help run the clock, then I think I would consider them crunch. But I also think the clock can run without them. So I give them crunch status based off of that very quick interpretation. If we have Flumpy, oh yeah, so we talked about Chewy. Roland's gonna just give all of his thoughts on Twitter. Great, can't wait for that. Chewy Game Jam, let's make that happen. So we were talking about in programming, a predetermined flow of actions that are repeatable as a single concept. Chewy games are those that have a simple mechanic that is elegant and drives further. Yeah, okay, perfect. Sean said it exactly the way that I wanted to say it, better than I did. Which doesn't make sense, or which does make sense. Sean is good at writing. um, I like this. I like this idea. Chewy games, what I have been calling medium games at the start of this, are things with a simple mechanic, a simple core, a big gear that the clock generally functions so long as that gear runs, and that gear can be supplemented or pushed along by other gears, smaller gears, uh, that can make it more elegant. That can turn it from a simple clock to a beautiful pocket watch. It is written. Perfect. Love it. Takes time to chew it over and then see how it interacts with everything else. Yeah. See, that's literally the experience of playing Blades of the Dark for me. So I'm glad that you're writing it that way. That's literally how Blades has always worked when I've played it, when I've run it, and when I've run it for other people. At first, we keep it simple, except for that one time when I really messed it up for that one guy. Keep it simple, and as I incorporate new things, they go, oh, I see how this all feeds into itself. I see how one thing goes into the other. I see how this is all woven together as one machine. But if I threw it all at them at once, we would repeat the mistake that I made in the past. But the core mechanic on itself, simple enough to grasp, easy enough to grasp. Yes, I think we've done it. What have we done? I don't know, but we've done it. It has been done. Um, yeah. I feel like I've said what I wanted to say about medium games. This largely feels like we've we've hit what we wanted to hit. That makes sense to me. This is how, and so I go back to my thesis, which I believe is, I think most of the games that we call rules light are actually chewy games. And why does that need to exist as a label? Because I think it is a more honest pitch to our possible customers slash players. Um, it helps them understand what they're getting into. And I also think that we generally have a category for something like this, simple core, elegant fixings that go on top of it. Um, I think people will start to see that, and they'll be able to identify that those are the games that they like. Case in point, when I was originally inventing Lumen, when I was writing Lumen, and I've talked about this with a billion people on interviews and stuff like that, I always talk about how much I like a gameplay loop, a defined, kind of tight gameplay loop. Why do I like that? Because of these types of games. They have a engine that runs it, a relatively simple engine, and then other things that supplement the engine that make a very interesting experience. That make that gameplay loop, which would normally be monotonous and boring, interesting because there are things that I can chew on to make that loop interesting. There we go. Yeah, that seems good. That seems like a good talk about medium. Yeah, I feel good about that. Sweet. Crunchy, chewy, light. Yeah, that's the new breakdown. Jacob Online says, I like this idea. Try to design my stuff in a way that you can teach the mechanics as you play without needing much of stuff up front. Yeah, that's the dream, right? The dream is to get you playing right away. At least that's my dream. So I like that. Okay, cool. That's medium. I think we're gonna stop talking about medium. I'm gonna take a quick break, and then I'm gonna come back, and I'm gonna put on the page this Gunlocks thing that's in like its sixth draft iteration, trying to figure out uh, starting fresh with a resistance game. So if you want to hang out and talk about resistance medium games, which is something we've talked about in a previous stream, I'll be back in just a couple minutes. So thank you everybody for talking about medium, and we'll talk about gun locks in a second.